Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
My name is Étienne Moreau, and I am 17 years old. The ink beneath my fingernails tells the story of these times better than any history book ever will. For 3 years now, I have worked as an apprentice to Maître Roussel at his printing house on Rue Saint-Antoine, just a stone's throw from that looming fortress they call the Bastille. Every morning I wake to the sound of its bells tolling the hour, and every evening I fall asleep to the sight of its 8 towers silhouetted against the Paris sky. But let me start from the beginning. From this morning, July 14th, in the year of our Lord 1789. A morning that began like any other with my hands already stained black from yesterday's work and the familiar smell of ink and paper filling my lungs. I had arrived at the workshop before dawn, as I always do. Maître Roussel trusts me with the early preparation. Sorting the type, cleaning the presses, mixing fresh ink. The work is methodical, almost meditative. Each letter has its place, each word its purpose. In these troubled times, when words have become weapons more powerful than muskets, I take pride in knowing that my hands help birth them into the world. The pamphlet I was setting that morning was different from our usual fare of prayer books and merchant announcements. The text was written by a man named Camille Desmoulins, a name that has been whispered more and more frequently in the coffee houses and taverns of our quarter. To arms, citizens, it read. The time for half measures is past. Liberty calls to her children. As I arranged each letter in the composing stick, I could feel the weight of those words. Not just their meaning, but their physical presence. The lead type felt heavier somehow, as if charged with the electricity that seems to crackle through the streets of Paris these days. Maître Roussel appeared just as the sun was beginning to filter through the grimy windows of our workshop. He is a man of perhaps 50 years, with grey streaked hair that he keeps tied back with a simple leather cord. His hands, like mine, are permanently stained with ink, but unlike me, he seems troubled by the work we've been doing of late. Étienne, he said, examining the pamphlet I had been setting. Are you certain about the spelling of revolution? The word appears 17 times in this text. I nodded. I had counted them myself. Yes, maître. Revolution. I've checked it against Desmoulins' manuscript 3 times. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. Once we printed psalms and wedding announcements. Now, he gestured at the inflammatory text. Now we print fire itself. It was then that we heard the commotion from the street. Not the usual mourning sounds of cartwheels on cobblestones and merchants calling their wares, but something different. Voices raised in excitement. The rapid footfall of many people moving with purpose. I wiped my hands on my leather apron and moved to the window. What I saw made my heart quicken. A crowd was gathering in the street below, perhaps 30 or 40 people, and more arriving by the minute. They carried an assortment of weapons, kitchen knives, farming tools, a few proper swords glinting in the morning light. But what struck me most was their faces. These were not the desperate, hungry faces I had grown accustomed to seeing in Paris. These faces were alive with something I had never witnessed before: purpose. A man I recognized as Henri, the baker from 2 streets over, was standing on an overturned crate, addressing the crowd. His voice carried up to our window. Citizens, the king has dismissed Necker. Our champion has been cast aside like yesterday's bread. Will we stand for this tyranny? The crowd's response was immediate and thunderous. No, no more. Maître Roussel joined me at the window, and I could feel his tension. This is not good, Étienne, when the people take to the streets like this. He didn't finish the thought, but I understood. We had both heard the stories from the provinces, of chateaux burned and tax collectors driven from their posts, but I felt something different. As I watched that crowd, as I heard their voices joining together in common cause, I felt a stirring in my chest that I'd never experienced before. It was as if all those words I had been setting in type, liberty, equality, justice, were suddenly taking flesh and bone form right before my eyes. Maître, I said, my voice barely a whisper, what if they're right? He looked at me sharply. Right about what? About all of it. About the king, about the nobles, about the need for change. What if the pamphlets we've been printing aren't just words? What if they're true? Before he could answer, another voice rose from the street. This one belonged to a young woman with dark hair escaping from beneath her cap. "The Bastille!" she cried. "We must take the Bastille. They have gunpowder there and arms. If we are to be free, we must have weapons." The crowd's energy shifted palpably. Where before there had been anger and frustration, now there was direction. The word Bastille passed from mouth to mouth like a flame jumping from candle to candle. I knew the fortress well, of course. How could I not? It dominated our neighborhood like a great stone beast, its walls rising nearly 80 feet into the sky. For centuries it had served as a prison for enemies of the state, though in recent years, I was told, it held only 7 prisoners. But the woman was right about the gunpowder. The Bastille served as an arsenal as well as a prison, and if revolution was truly coming to Paris, weapons would be needed. "I must go down to them," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had consciously decided to speak them. "Étienne, no!" Maître Roussel's hand fell on my shoulder. "You are apprentice to me. Your duty is here. To the craft, to the work." But the work? Suddenly it seemed so small, so removed from the great currents of history that were flowing through the streets below. "Maître, for months we have printed calls to action. How can I remain idle when action itself is at hand?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I could hear the crowd beginning to move. Not dispersing, but organizing itself, choosing leaders, making plans. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard. Hundreds of individual voices becoming something larger, something powerful. "If you go," he said finally, "you may not be able to return. Not to this workshop. Not to this life. Are you prepared for that?" I looked down at my ink-stained hands, at the half-set pamphlet on the composing table, at the familiar tools of my trade. 3 years of my life were contained in this room. 3 years of learning and growing and finding my place in the world. But outside, history itself was walking past our door. "I think," I said slowly, "that none of us will be able to return to the lives we knew before today." Maître Roussel nodded gravely. "Then go, boy. Go and see what your words look like when they become deeds." I removed my leather apron and hung it on its customary peg. My hands were shaking, whether from fear or excitement I could not say. Perhaps both. As I reached for the door handle, Maître Roussel called my name. "Étienne. Remember that you are not just a participant in whatever is to come. You are a witness. Your craft has taught you to observe closely, to choose words carefully. The world will need such witnesses in the days ahead." I nodded, though I was not sure I understood what he meant. Then I stepped out into the street and into the crowd. The energy was intoxicating. Bodies pressed close around me, voices overlapping in excited conversation. I caught fragments. "Heard they've been storing grain while we starve." "Swiss guards at the palace, foreign soldiers on French soil. Time to show them what free men can do." A hand grabbed my shoulder, and I turned to see a man perhaps 10 years older than myself, his clothes marking him as a carpenter or furniture maker. "You're Roussel's apprentice, aren't you, the printer's boy?" "I am." His grip tightened. "Then you can read? Yes? And write?" "Of course." "Good. We'll have need of such skills before this day is done." He pressed a folded paper into my hand. "From Desmoulins himself. Read it aloud when we reach the square." I unfolded the paper, recognizing immediately the handwriting I had been transcribing all morning. But these were new words, written in haste with a quill that had been pressed too hard against the paper. "Citizens of Paris, the hour of liberation has struck. No longer will we beg for crumbs from the king's table while foreign mercenaries sharpen their swords at our throats. To the Bastille. Let us tear down this symbol of tyranny stone by stone." The crowd was moving now, flowing eastward along Rue Saint-Antoine toward the fortress. I found myself carried along, no longer a conscious participant, but part of something larger, like a drop of water in a rushing river. The sound of our footsteps on the cobblestones created a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, and gradually voices began to join in song. The Te Deum at first, then other hymns, and finally songs I had never heard before. Songs that seemed to be born in that very moment from the collective voice of the crowd. As we walked, the crowd grew. From side streets and alleyways, from workshops and taverns, people emerged to join us. I saw faces I recognized from the neighborhood, the butcher's wife, the young priest from St. Paul, the Spanish cobbler who repaired my shoes. But I also saw strangers, people from other quarters of the city who had somehow heard the call and answered it. The crowd's energy focused on that gate like sunlight through a lens. Someone near the front began to shout, "Open the gates! Release Antoine! Free all prisoners!" Others took up the cry until it became a chant that echoed off the stone walls. "Open the gates! Open the gates!" But the soldiers remained motionless, their muskets held at ready. I could see their faces beneath their tricorn hats. Young men, most of them probably not much older than myself. They looked nervous, uncertain. They had been trained to fight armies, not crowds of angry citizens. A man pushed through the crowd near me. I recognized him as one of the electors of Paris, a member of the provisional government formed after the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. "Citizens," he cried, "I have just come from the Hôtel de Ville. The city government has voted to form a citizen militia. But we need arms. We need gunpowder, and both lie within those walls." The chant changed instantly. "Arms! Arms! Give us arms!" I found myself swept forward as the crowd pressed closer to the fortress. The carpenter who had given me Desmoulins's pamphlet appeared at my elbow again. "Now, boy, read the words." I climbed onto a pile of cobblestones torn from the street and unfolded the paper. My voice cracked at first, but gradually grew stronger. "Citizens of Paris, the hour of liberation has struck. No longer will we beg for crumbs from the king's table while foreign mercenaries sharpen their swords at our throats. To the Bastille! Let us tear down this symbol of tyranny stone by stone." The crowd roared. They waved their weapons, embraced each other, but more importantly, they moved. What followed was chaos, but chaos with a strange kind of order. Small groups broke off from the crowd, some trying to scale the walls, others scouting weak points in the stonework. A delegation approached the main gate under a white flag to negotiate with the governor, a man named Delaunay. I joined a group that had found a passage to the outer courtyard. We were led by a former soldier named Elie, who seemed to know tactics. "The gunpowder is stored in the inner courtyard," he said, "but first we must take the outer defenses." The passage opened into a walled courtyard. Above us, soldiers moved along the ramparts, muskets ready. The moment hung like a held breath. Then, the first shot. I never knew who fired first. A soldier? A citizen? But once it began, it spread like wildfire. Musket balls ricocheted off the walls. Smoke filled the air. I pressed myself against the stone, heart pounding. This was not the revolution I had imagined in the calm of the printing house. This was blood, chaos, pain. And yet even amid the fare there were moments of stillness, a strip of sunlight across the stones, a flag rustling on the battlements like a frightened bird. I remembered Maître Roussel's words, "Be a witness." I saw things I will never forget. A woman darting into gunfire to pull a wounded man to safety. A boy climbing the fortress wall with nothing but a rope and raw determination. The siege lasted for hours. The sun climbed, then began to fall. The air shimmered with smoke and heat, and slowly, inevitably, the Bastille began to fall. The outer defenses collapsed under the sheer force of numbers. Citizens flooded the courtyards. I later heard that Governor Delaunay had agreed to surrender, in exchange for safe passage. It was a promise that would not be kept. I was in the inner courtyard when the great gates finally opened. The crowd that surged through was no longer organized. This was something else. Primal. Dangerous. The taste of victory had mixed with blood and smoke to create something almost wild. They found the gunpowder, the muskets, the cannons, and then they found Governor Delaunay. I will not describe what followed. Some things are too terrible for words, even for print. His head and that of the garrison commander were soon paraded through the streets on the points of pikes. The sight sickened me, but it taught me something no pamphlet ever had. Revolution does not come gently. When the old world falls, it does not step aside. It crashes down, and those beneath it are crushed. They found the gunpowder stores first, barrel after barrel of black powder that would arm the citizen militia. They found the fortress's small supply of muskets and cannons, but they also found Governor de Launay, and what happened next will haunt my dreams until the day I die. I will not describe it in detail. Some things are too terrible to put into words, even words set in type and printed for posterity. I will say only that the governor's promise of safe passage was forgotten in the heat of revolutionary fervor, and that his head, along with that of the garrison commander, was soon carried through the streets of Paris on the point of a pike. The sight sickened me, but it also taught me something about the nature of revolution that no pamphlet had ever conveyed. Change does not come gently. The old order does not step aside politely to make way for the new. When the foundations of society shift, they shift violently, catastrophically, and those caught in between are crushed. As evening fell and the excitement began to fade, I found myself standing in the fortress's main courtyard, surrounded by the debris of victory. Citizens were still searching the building for prisoners to liberate. They found only 7, 4 forgers, 2 minor criminals, and a young nobleman imprisoned by his own father. Others had begun demolition, attacking the walls with whatever tools they could find. The carpenter appeared beside me again. His clothes were torn and stained with blood, whether his own or someone else's, I could not say. "Well, printer's boy," he said, "what do you think of revolution now?" I looked around at the destruction, at the people who had accomplished the unthinkable, at the stones of the Bastille already being pried loose as souvenirs. "I think," I said slowly, "that it is more terrible and more wonderful than I had imagined." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "That it is, boy, that it is." I made my way home through the streets of Paris. Lanterns glowed in windows. Taverns were full of citizens retelling the day's events. Each story slightly different, each emphasizing a different detail, a different moment of heroism or horror. But they were all part of the same story. The story of a day when ordinary people chose not to bow. A day when they decided they would no longer accept the unacceptable, would no longer serve those who saw them as subjects rather than citizens. I found Maître Roussel still in the workshop, working by candlelight. He looked up. "Étienne, you're alive." "I am." I sat down on a stool, overwhelmed by exhaustion. "The Bastille has fallen." "I heard. The bells have been ringing for hours." He paused. "What was it like?" I struggled for words. "It was like watching your words come to life," I said finally. "All those pamphlets we've printed, today they walk the streets of Paris." Maître Roussel was silent for a long time, then he asked, "And tomorrow?" I had been asking myself the same question. The Bastille had fallen, but the king still reigned. The poor were still hungry. The nobles still held power. "Tomorrow," I said, "we continue. We print more pamphlets, we spread more words, we help build whatever comes next." And that is what we did. In the days that followed, our press ran without rest, printing stories, declarations, calls to action. The words flowed like water from a broken dam, carrying the revolution to every corner of France. But late at night, when the press was still and the workshop was quiet, I would sometimes look out the window toward where the Bastille had stood. The demolition work continued day and night, citizens taking turns, with hammers and pickaxes, to tear down the fortress stone by stone. They called themselves the Patriotic Volunteers of the Bastille, and they worked with the fervor of men building a cathedral rather than destroying a prison. I watched them work, these ordinary people who had become extraordinary through their actions, and I tried to understand what I had witnessed on that July day. Was it the birth of freedom, as the pamphlets proclaimed, or was it simply the violent transfer of power from one group of masters to another? I think now, years later, that it was both. Revolution is like a fire. It destroys, but it also illuminates. It burns away the old and creates space for the new, but it cannot guarantee that what grows in that space will be better than what came before. What I knew for certain was that I had been present at a moment when the impossible became possible, when the powerless discovered their power, when words that had lived only on printed pages suddenly took on flesh and blood and changed the world. Sometimes when the shop is quiet and the night deepens, I still hear her voice, the woman with the bundle of bread and the kitchen knife telling me her husband died of hunger, that she had nothing left to lose. Her words linger like the scent of smoke after a fire, fading, but never quite gone. It burns away the old and creates space for the new, but it cannot guarantee that what grows in that space will be better than what came before. What I knew for certain was that I had been present at a moment when the impossible became possible, when the powerless discovered their power, when words that had lived only on printed pages suddenly took on flesh and blood and changed the world. Sometimes when the shop is quiet and the night deepens, I still hear her voice, the woman with the bundle of bread and the kitchen knife telling me her husband died of hunger, that she had nothing left to lose. Her words linger like the scent of smoke after a fire, fading, but never quite gone. What rose from those ashes was the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, that all men are created equal, that liberty is not a privilege to be granted by kings, but a right to be claimed by citizens. These ideas, like the stones of the Bastille itself, spread far beyond France. They inspired revolutions in other lands and other times. They were printed and reprinted, translated into dozens of languages, carried across oceans by ships and across continents by travelers who had been touched by the fire that began in Paris on that July day. I'm an old man now, and the world has changed in ways I could never have imagined. The revolution that began with the fall of the Bastille has run its course, leaving behind both achievements and tragedies, both fulfilled promises and broken dreams. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cobblestones beneath my feet as we march toward the fortress. I can still hear the voices of ordinary people raised in common cause. I can still smell the gunpowder and feel the electricity in the air when a people decided they would no longer accept the unacceptable. That feeling, that moment when the impossible became possible, is what I carry with me into sleep. It is what I hold on to when the world seems dark and change seems impossible. It is the knowledge that history is not something that happens to us, but something we make. The Bastille is gone now, its stones scattered across Paris, but the idea it represented, the idea that ordinary people have the power to tear down walls, to challenge authority, to reshape the world according to their vision of justice, that idea lives on. The Bastille fell on July 14th, 1789. But the real revolution, the revolution of ideas, of possibility, of human dignity, that revolution continues still. And now as the candle burns low and sleep calls to me, I close my eyes and remember that day, when a printer's apprentice became a witness to history, when words became deeds, when the impossible became inevitable. The ashes of the Bastille have long since blown away on the wind, but the fire they represented burns eternal, passed from one generation to the next, a flame that can never be truly extinguished, as long as there are people willing to believe that a better world is possible.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.